The dawn broke grey and cold over the North Atlantic. On May 3rd, 1941, a small merchant convoy was moving through waters that had become a hunting ground. Somewhere beyond the horizon, German reconnaissance aircraft were circling, waiting for the signal to strike. On the bridge of the merchant ship Empire Spray, Captain Andrew Burr stood watching the sea, his hands gripping the rail so hard his knuckles had gone white. He was thinking about death. Not in the abstract way that a man thinks about death in peacetime, not as something distant and theoretical. He was thinking about it the way a soldier thinks about it when it's close enough to touch. Behind him, lashed to the catapult on the deck, sat a single Hawker Hurricane. It was the only defense this entire convoy had against the German long-range reconnaissance bombers that would soon arrive. Andrew Burr would pilot it. But this Hurricane was different from the ones that flew from airfields back in England. It had no landing gear that would fold up cleanly into its fuselage. It had no runway to return to. Once he launched from this catapult, powered by a single explosive charge that would hurl this machine into the sky, there was only one certainty: he would never fly that aircraft back to this ship. This was the CAM ship program, Catapult Aircraft Merchantman, a desperate innovation born from the hunger of necessity. As convoy after convoy was picked apart by the Fokker-Wulf Condors, those long-range German bombers that could spot merchant ships from 100 miles away, someone in the British Admiralty had asked a simple, terrible question. What if we gave ordinary cargo ships a single fighter, launched on a single mission, with no expectation of recovery? What if we turned merchant vessels into floating fighter bases, each one capable of hurling a hurricane into the sky for one desperate, unthinkable attack? The answer was Andrew Burr, standing on the deck of the Empire Spray, staring at the hurricane that would carry him toward a fate that was sealed the moment he climbed into its cockpit. Andrew Henry Burr was born in 1914 inches Surrey, a market town southwest of London, where the air still smelled of horses and rain. His father was a surgeon, a man who believed that discipline and excellence were not merely virtues, but obligations. His mother, Margaret, was quieter. She played piano and kept a garden that her neighbors envied. Andrew was the middle child, with an older sister and a younger brother. By all accounts, he was an ordinary boy. He collected insects, climbed trees, and spent summers helping his father organize the shelves of his surgery, fascinated by the precision of the instruments and the calm certainty with which his father approached each patient. But when Andrew was 16, his mother died. It was influenza, and it was sudden. One week she was in her garden, the next she was gone. His father never fully recovered from this loss. He poured himself into his work with a ferocity that frightened his children. Andrew, being sensitive to the suffering of others in a way that his father was not, made a decision that would define his life. He would find a way to help people. He would find a way to matter. In 1933, when Andrew was 19, he joined the Royal Air Force. He had a clear purpose in his mind. He would be a pilot, and he would defend his country. The training was rigorous. It broke most men and forged the rest into something harder, something colder. Andrew survived it, but not without cost. He learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the discipline to act despite it. He learned that discipline could save your life. He learned that it could also cost you your humanity, bit by bit, until you were standing on the deck of a ship at sea, about to launch yourself into the sky, knowing you would never return. By May 1941, Andrew had been a pilot for 8 years. He had fought in France and watched his squadron get torn to pieces over the Channel. He had retreated to England and spent months running combat air patrols over the home islands, chasing German bombers. He had shot down enemy aircraft. He had buried friends. He had learned to live in a state of perpetual uncertainty, never knowing if the next mission would be his last. And then, in April 1941, he had volunteered for the CAM ship program. Why would a man volunteer for something like this? Why would an experienced pilot, a man who had already cheated death a dozen times over, choose to put himself in a position where survival was not merely unlikely, it was impossible? Andrew's officers asked him this question directly. He gave them different answers depending on his mood. Sometimes he said he was tired of watching his friends die uselessly. Sometimes he said the convoy system needed defending. Sometimes he said he believed in the cause. But the truth was simpler and more terrible than any of those answers. Andrew Burr had spent 8 years watching people die, and he had begun to believe that death might be preferable to watching one more friend fall out of the sky. The CAM ship was not hope, but it was something. It was action. And for a man drowning in the weight of his own survival, action had become a kind of prayer. The convoy had sailed from port 5 days ago. There were 13 merchant ships in total, carrying food, rubber, and industrial materials bound for Britain. Without these supplies, the nation would slowly strangle. Every mile they traveled across the Atlantic was a victory. Every mile they traveled was also an exposure to German air attacks. The Focke-Wulf Condors operated out of Brest in occupied France. They had a range of 2,200 miles. They could fly out over the Atlantic, spot a convoy, circle it, wait for the sun to reach the right angle for bombing, and then descend to attack. By the time the Condors arrived, there was nothing the convoy could do but hope. Until now. Until the Empire Spray. Andrew had spent the past 5 days in a state of careful preparation. He had checked the Hurricane's ammunition hundreds of times. He had reviewed the catapult launch procedure until he could recite it in his sleep. He had studied the maps of the Atlantic and calculated the fuel capacity of his aircraft. He had looked at the mathematics of the problem. A Focke-Wulf Condor flew at approximately 190 miles per hour. A Hurricane could fly at 320 miles per hour. That meant if he could get airborne and gain altitude, he could intercept any enemy aircraft in the vicinity. His job was simple: shoot it down before it could dive on the merchant ships below. What happened after he shot it down was the part of the equation that everyone tried not to think about. On the morning of May 3rd, a lookout spotted a Focke-Wulf Condor on the horizon. It was approximately 40 miles away, circling the convoy at altitude. This was the signal. The Germans had found them. An attack would come within hours. Andrew was told to prepare for launch. He climbed into the cockpit of the Hurricane. The smell of oil and metal surrounded him. His hands, already cold from the morning air, seemed to freeze completely as he strapped himself into the seat. Behind him, the deck crew moved with practiced efficiency, checking the catapult launch mechanism, ensuring that everything was ready. Andrew ran through his pre-flight checks. Engine temperature? Good. Fuel levels? Full. Guns? Armed and ready. Everything was perfect. Everything was prepared. Everything was ready for an event that had never been tested, never been fully proven to work, and which many observers believed would result in the pilot's death. At 0847 hours, Captain Robert Eccles gave the order to launch. The catapult beneath the Hurricane fired with a violence that felt like the Earth itself was trying to throw him into the sky. Andrew was pressed back into his seat with a force that seemed to stop his heart. For a moment, a horrible, endless moment, the Hurricane resisted. It seemed to crawl along the deck, dragging its way forward, as though the ship itself was trying to hold it back. And then, suddenly, the momentum caught. The aircraft shot forward like a bullet, and in an instant, the deck fell away beneath him. He was airborne. He was alone. He was committed to a course of action from which there was no return. Andrew pointed the nose of the Hurricane upward and climbed into the sky. Behind him, the convoy was already shrinking. In front of him, the vast grey Atlantic stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere in this emptiness, there were German bombers. Somewhere in this emptiness, there was a purpose that justified his existence. Somewhere in this emptiness, death was waiting. The Focke-Wulf Condor saw him coming. The German crew aboard the aircraft, 4 men, experienced and professional, recognized immediately what was happening. A fighter had been launched from one of the merchant ships. This was unexpected, but not unprecedented. The German pilot, Oberleutnant Karl Stotz, had encountered cam ships before. He knew the procedure. He knew that he had one advantage: altitude. The Condor was already at 15,000 feet. The Hurricane, just launched, was climbing from sea level. But Stotz had made a tactical error. In his confidence, he had allowed the Condor to drift too close to the convoy. He had believed that his altitude advantage was sufficient. He had believed that by the time the Hurricane reached his altitude, his gunners would have already picked up the climbing fighter and tracked it. He had believed many things that were about to be violently proven wrong. Andrew climbed through 3,000 feet. His heart was beating fast, but his hands were steady on the controls. He had trained for this moment 1,000 times in his mind. He had visualized the intercept, the approach, the attack. He had rehearsed it so many times that his body seemed to move through the procedure automatically, freed from the paralyzing weight of conscious thought. At 8,000 feet, he spotted the Condor. It was to his northeast, and it was beginning to maneuver. The German pilot had seen him. The Condor was turning, diving slightly, attempting to evade. But Andrew was climbing toward its altitude, and his Hurricane was faster. He began banking toward the enemy aircraft, adjusting his course to intercept. The radio crackled in his earpiece. It was Captain Eccles, speaking from the bridge of the Empire Spray, far below. "Good luck, Burr. We're with you." Andrew did not reply. He was past the point where words mattered. He was past the point where anything mattered except the next 30 seconds. He was at 12,000 feet now, and the Condor was directly ahead of him. The German aircraft was attempting to climb away, but it was too late. Andrew was too close, too fast, too committed. He pulled the stick back slightly, bringing the Hurricane's nose up, and squeezed the trigger. The 8 Browning machine guns in the wings of the Hurricane began to fire. The noise was deafening. The recoil seemed to shudder through the entire airframe. Tracer rounds stretched out across the sky like threads of red fire, reaching across the gap between the two aircraft. Some of them went wide, but many of them found their target. Andrew saw the Condor's fuselage light up as the rounds impacted. Smoke began to trail from one of the engines. The German pilot was attempting to dive away, but the damage was severe. The aircraft was beginning to lose altitude rapidly. It was losing power. Andrew closed the distance further and fired again. This second burst was closer, more accurate. He saw fabric tearing from the wing. He saw metal peeling away from the fuselage. He saw fire beginning to bloom from the right-hand engines. The Condor could not recover. The damage was too severe. The pilot, Oberleutnant Karl Stotz, was making a desperate decision. He would attempt to ditch in the sea. It was not a choice born of hope, but of the simple recognition that staying in the air was no longer an option. Andrew watched as the Condor descended through 10,000 feet, trailing smoke and fire. It was going down. He had shot it down. The first Condor, the first German bomber, the first victory of the day. But he was not finished. As the first Condor was descending toward the sea, Andrew was already looking for the next target. His fuel was still good. His ammunition was still plentiful. The convoy was still under threat, and somewhere in the sky above the Atlantic, there was at least one more Focke-Wulf Condor. He did not have to search for long. Less than 5 minutes after he shot down Stotz's aircraft, he spotted another Condor. This one at 10 o'clock. Approximately 3 miles away, this bomber was already positioning for an attack on the convoy. Andrew could see it clearly now. The long, twin-boom fuselage of the Condor, the distinctive high wings, the 4 engines. It was a formidable aircraft, but it was not a fighter, and Andrew was a fighter pilot. He banked hard to port and accelerated toward the second Condor. The German crew saw him coming. This time, there was no miscalculation. This time, the Condor pilot, Hauptmann Friedrich Rolf, was taking no chances. He was already diving away, calling for maximum power from his engines, attempting to put distance between his aircraft and the climbing Hurricane. But Rolf had made the same mistake as Stotz. He had allowed his aircraft to remain at an altitude where the Hurricane could reach it. He had believed that his experience and his 4 engines would be sufficient. He was about to learn that belief was not enough. Andrew climbed after him. The chase was on. The Hurricane was gaining on the Condor, eating up the gap between them with relentless speed. Andrew was now fully committed to the intercept. There was no thought of survival. No calculation of fuel remaining, no consideration of what would happen after. There was only the pure, crystalline clarity of a pilot pursuing an enemy aircraft. At 9,000 feet, Andrew was close enough to open fire. The guns of the Hurricane roared to life again. Tracer rounds reached out across the gap. The Condor's fuselage lit up with impacts. The German aircraft began to lose altitude rapidly. Smoke poured from one of the engines. Then another engine was hit. Then a third. But Rolf was not giving up. He was flying a dying aircraft, an aircraft that was barely responding to his controls. But he was still trying to maneuver away from the Hurricane. He was still trying to survive. Andrew understood the impulse. He respected it, and he ended it with one final burst of gunfire that broke the Condor's back and sent it tumbling toward the sea. 2 Condors, 2 confirmed kills, and Andrew was already looking for the next target. This pattern would continue for the next hour. Andrew Burr, alone in his Hurricane, would pursue and shoot down Focke-Wulf Condor. After Focke-Wulf Condor, the German bombers came in 1s and 2s. First as a coordinated force, then increasingly as panicked individual pilots attempting to escape a skillful and relentless enemy. Andrew shot down the third Condor at 11,000 feet. He shot down the fourth from a head-on attack that was so close he could see the terrified faces of the German gunners before his bullets found them. He shot down the fifth as it was diving for the convoy, desperate to deliver its bombs before the Hurricane could reach it. The fifth Condor managed to release its ordnance before Andrew's guns found it, but the bombs fell wide of the merchant ships, exploding harmlessly in the sea. The sixth, seventh, and eighth Condors came in rapid succession. Andrew was running low on fuel now. His ammunition was depleted. His hands were shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. His oxygen supply was beginning to run dangerously low, but he was still flying. He was still fighting. He was still intercepting enemy bombers and sending them down into the Atlantic. By 1100 hours, it was over. 8 Focke-Wulf Condors had been shot down. The German Air Force had called off its attack. The convoy was safe. The merchant ships below had never been touched, and Andrew Burr, his fuel nearly exhausted, his oxygen depleted, his ammunition expended, was faced with the reality of his situation. He was floating above an empty Atlantic, with no fuel left in his tank. The ditching procedure was something Andrew had rehearsed mentally but never practiced. No pilot ever wanted to crash a Hurricane into the sea. The aircraft was not designed for water landing. The impact would be violent. It would likely tear the airframe apart, and afterward, a pilot would be floating in the cold Atlantic, hoping that someone would pick him up before hypothermia set in. Andrew descended toward the surface of the water. The altimeter was spinning down. The engine was coughing, sputtering, dying. He was at 500 feet now, 400 feet, 300 feet. He could see individual whitecaps on the waves. He could see the vastness of the ocean stretching out beneath him in every direction. He lowered the landing gear, a futile gesture, but protocol and prepared for the impact. The Hurricane touched the water at approximately 70 miles per hour. For a moment, there was a sensation of slowing, of resistance. Then the right wing caught in the water, and the aircraft cartwheeled. The fuselage twisted. Metal screamed. Glass shattered. The world became a violent blur of water and sky and twisted metal. When the tumbling finally stopped, Andrew was hanging upside down in his seat, water pouring in through the shattered canopy. The interior of the cockpit was flooding rapidly. He fumbled with the harness that was holding him in place, working desperately to release himself. His hands were numb. His lungs were already burning from holding his breath. He had perhaps 30 seconds before the aircraft would sink completely. The harness released. Andrew pushed upward or downward. He could no longer tell in the disorientation of the moment, and kicked his way out of the sinking Hurricane. He broke the surface of the water and gasped for air. The cold was immediate and terrible. It was as though someone had wrapped his body in chains of ice. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. His muscles were already beginning to seize. He was not alone for long. The convoy had seen him ditch. A destroyer escort vessel, HMS Peony, was already turning toward him. Andrew could see the ship cutting through the water, moving toward his position. A rope was being thrown. Men were shouting. Within minutes, he was being hauled aboard, shaking violently, his skin already developing the blue color of severe hypothermia. Andrew Burr had survived. He had shot down 8 enemy aircraft. He had protected the convoy, and he had lived to tell the story. But the story did not end with his rescue. What followed was something far more complex than a simple tale of heroism and triumph. What followed was investigation, politics, and institutional inertia. When Andrew was brought aboard HMS Peony, he was barely conscious. He was rushed to the medical bay, where the ship's surgeon did everything possible to treat the severe hypothermia. For 2 days, Andrew drifted in and out of consciousness, his body struggling to recover from the shock of the cold water. When he finally woke clearly, his first question was about the convoy. "The merchants made it," a naval officer told him. "Every single ship. Not a single vessel lost. You saved them all." Andrew nodded but said nothing. He was thinking about the 8 German crews. He was thinking about the men he had killed. He was thinking about whether this was victory or murder or some complicated thing that existed in the space between those 2 words. The debriefing began immediately. Military officials from the Air Ministry arrived aboard HMS Peony with questions. They wanted every detail. How had he achieved 8 confirmed kills? What was his technique? What had been the weather conditions? What was his fuel consumption rate? They took notes and photographs. They asked him to recount the combat sequence again and again, from every angle, until the events seemed to lose their connection to reality and became instead a series of abstract tactical problems. But buried in their questions was another concern, one that became explicit only after the debriefing was complete. "There's going to be a problem," one of the officers told Andrew, speaking quietly, away from the others, "with the kill count." "What problem?" Andrew asked. "Officially, we've only confirmed 7 of your 8 claimed kills. The 8th one, the one you shot down last, the merchant ship captains couldn't see it from their vantage point. There's no independent confirmation." Andrew stared at this man in disbelief. "I shot it down. I was there." "I know," the officer said, "but the rules are clear. 2 independent witnesses are required for confirmed kill credits. Without that, they're calling it a probable, not a confirmed." This was the beginning of the bureaucratic nightmare. The Admiralty claimed 8 confirmed kills. The Air Ministry claimed 7, confirmed and 1 probable. Newspapers seized on different versions of the story. Some accounts had Andrew shooting down 9 aircraft. Others had him shooting down 6. The truth was compressed and distorted through the machinery of propaganda and official channels. But there was something darker beneath this confusion. There was an institutional resistance to what Andrew had done. The camship program was controversial. It was dangerous. It was costly in terms of pilot losses, and more importantly, it was not the official doctrine of the Royal Air Force. Senior officers in the RAF were uncomfortable with the idea that a merchant sailor, Andrew Burr, had been commissioned as an officer, but was not formally part of the RAF structure, could achieve such dramatic success, operating outside normal command structures. 6 weeks after the engagement, Andrew was called before a review board. The board was composed of senior RAF officers who wanted to know the exact procedure he had followed. They wanted to know if he had violated any standing orders. They wanted to know if the risks taken were justified by the results achieved. It was a brilliant piece of bureaucratic maneuvering. By framing the investigation as a procedural review, the board was able to avoid the uncomfortable question of why an innovation was threatening the institutional prestige of the RAF establishment. Instead, they could focus on technical questions and regulatory compliance. But Andrew saw through it. He understood what was happening. And for a moment, in the quiet of that hearing room, he understood why desperate men sometimes took desperate measures, not because they were heroes, because they were human. And they could not bear to watch the system fail one more time. Yet something unexpected happened. The story of Andrew Burr's 8 kills had captured the imagination of the public. The newspapers had run with the story, despite the official confusion about the kill count. Andrew's photograph appeared in the papers, a young man with dark hair and intense eyes, looking directly at the camera, with an expression that was difficult to read. Was it pride? Exhaustion? Grief for the men he had killed? The photographs could mean anything. The public saw what they wanted to see, and what they wanted to see was a hero. A man who had done the impossible, a man who had proven that innovation, courage, and individual initiative could overcome institutional inertia. The pressure on the Air Ministry and the Admiralty was significant. Questions were asked in Parliament. Members of Parliament wanted to know why the camship program was not being expanded. They wanted to know what else could be done to protect the convoys. They wanted to know if there were other Andrew Burrs out there, waiting to be deployed. The result was a modest but meaningful shift in policy. The camship program, which had been on the verge of being discontinued, was expanded. Additional merchant ships were equipped with catapults, additional pilots were trained for the program, and most importantly, the naval and air authorities began to take the program more seriously, as a legitimate defense against the German bombing campaign. But Andrew was not there to see this expansion. He had been reassigned. He had been given a desk job at the Air Ministry, where he was supposed to help develop doctrine for long-range fighter operations. It was a quiet reassignment. Not a punishment, but not a reward either. It was the institutional equivalent of being shelved. Andrew accepted the assignment without complaint. But it destroyed him in ways that combat never had. A pilot's purpose is to fly. A pilot's identity is forged in the sky. When Andrew was removed from active service and placed behind a desk, he was being asked to sacrifice the thing that made him who he was. The regulations and procedures and doctrine that he was now asked to help develop were, to him, the same institutional inertia that had cost thousands of lives. His wife, Margaret, the daughter of a Kent farmer, whom he had married in 1939, watched her husband slowly disappear. He would come home from the Air Ministry in the evenings, with a distant look in his eyes. He would eat dinner without tasting the food. He would fall asleep in his chair and wake up shouting about enemy aircraft. She wanted to help him, but there was nothing she could do. His wounds were not physical. They could not be bandaged or healed. In late 1942, after nearly a year and a half of desk work, Andrew requested transfer back to operational flying. The request was denied. The Air Ministry had invested too much in keeping him alive to let him throw his life away in combat. They offered him a training position instead. He would teach young pilots how to conduct fighter interceptions. It was a safe job. It was a meaningful contribution to the war effort. It was also a kind of death for a man who needed to fly. Andrew was at the brink of something dangerous. He was at the brink of breaking. His wife could see it. His commanding officers could see it. Everyone could see it, except Andrew himself, who was looking in a direction that none of them could follow. And then, in November 1942, the news came. The Focke-Wulf Condor that Andrew had shot down during his last mission, the one for which he had been credited with a probable, rather than a confirmed kill, had been examined by German records after the capture of some Luftwaffe documents. The German records confirmed that the aircraft had been shot down by Andrew's fire. The kill was confirmed. 8 confirmed kills, not 7, and 1 probable, 8. It was a small thing. It was a piece of bureaucratic correction. But for Andrew, it was the recognition he had been waiting for. It was the institutional acknowledgement that what he had done was real. It mattered. It counted. And something shifted inside him. The pressure that had been building for 18 months found an outlet. The anger and frustration and grief that he had been carrying found a place to rest. He was able to breathe again. The war continued for 3 more years after Andrew's 8 confirmed kills. The convoy system continued to operate, with camships, and later with small escort carriers protecting the merchant vessels against enemy air attack. The Focke-Wulf Condors continued to fly reconnaissance and bombing missions until late in the war, when the combination of Allied fighter escorts and increasingly effective convoy defenses made their operations too costly to sustain. Andrew Burr remained in the Royal Air Force throughout the war. He continued to teach, he continued to contribute to the development of fighter doctrine, and he continued to live with the weight of what he had done. 8 Focke-Wulf Condors shot down, 8 German crews, approximately 40 men total dead because of his actions. He never stopped thinking about them. He never stopped wondering if there was a way he could have accomplished the same defensive objective without taking lives. After the war ended in May 1945, Andrew was released from service. He had put in 18 years in the Royal Air Force. He was 31 years old. He had flown hundreds of combat missions. He had shot down at least 8 confirmed enemy aircraft. He had been decorated with the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was a hero. But heroes, Andrew had learned, were not made of different material than ordinary men. Heroes were simply ordinary men who had been placed in extraordinary circumstances and who had chosen to act. The choice was the only difference. Everything else was circumstance and luck and timing. Andrew returned to civilian life. He took a job as a commercial airline pilot. He flew across the Atlantic on the same routes that the convoys had traveled during the war. He flew with steadiness and skill, and no trace of the extraordinary ability he had displayed in combat. Some of his passengers wondered if he was thinking about the war. Most did not even know that this quiet, professional pilot had once been at the center of a significant historical moment. He and his wife had 3 children. They lived in a comfortable house in Kent, near where Margaret's father still farmed. Andrew became involved in his local community. He served on the board of the parish council. He joined a flying club, where he taught young pilots how to handle their aircraft in difficult conditions. He lived quietly, without fame or public recognition, for 43 years. In 1986, Andrew Burr died of a heart attack at the age of 72. His obituary appeared in a few newspapers, identifying him as former RAF officer and pioneer of the camship program. It did not mention 8 confirmed kills. It did not mention the Condors. It did not mention the day when a single pilot changed the course of the air war over the Atlantic. But the technical historians and the military scholars knew. They knew that Andrew Burr had proven that the camship program could work. His 8 kills, more than most camship pilots would ever achieve in their entire careers, had demonstrated that with skill, courage, and perfect execution, a single fighter could protect an entire convoy. More importantly, He had proven that innovation and individual initiative could challenge institutional inertia and produce tangible results. The legacy of Andrew Burr and the camship program extended far beyond his 8 confirmed kills. What he had demonstrated was a principle that would shape military doctrine for decades to come. The principle that specialized, high-risk military missions could be justified if the benefit to the overall strategic situation was significant enough. The camship program operated from 1941 until 1943. During those 2 years, 170 camships were equipped and deployed. Approximately 300 pilot sorties were flown from these ships. In total, camship pilots achieved 17 confirmed kills and an additional 6 probable kills against enemy aircraft. The losses were relatively low. Only a handful of pilots were killed in the program. Most pilots, like Andrew Burr, ditched their aircraft in the sea after completing their missions and were rescued. But the true measure of the program's success was not the kill-to-loss ratio. The true measure was the fact that German air commanders began to treat the convoy regions with greater caution. The knowledge that any convoy might have a Hurricane fighter launched at them was enough to make German bomber pilots more conservative in their approach tactics. They would maintain greater altitude and distance. They would be more likely to abort attacks if they spotted a defending fighter. Over time, this caution reduced the overall effectiveness of the German bombing campaign against the convoys. The camship program would eventually be replaced by escort carriers, small aircraft carriers that could carry a full fighter contingent and launch and recover their aircraft. These escort carriers were a more complete solution to the convoy defense problem, but they would not have been developed so quickly or so effectively if it were not for the lessons learned from the camship program and from pilots like Andrew Burr. Military doctrine at the highest levels was influenced by the camship experience. Senior commanders learned that sometimes the best defense against an enemy capability is not a perfect technological solution, but rather an asymmetrical response that leverages ingenuity and sacrifice. The willingness of a pilot to climb into an aircraft knowing that he would not return, not because of a suicidal mission, but because of genuine strategic need, became a model for other high-risk military operations that emerged later in the war and in subsequent conflicts. After the war, military historians and strategists studied the camship program extensively. They wanted to understand how an innovation that had seemed reckless and impossible could actually work. The conclusions they reached were nuanced. The program had worked because it had been carefully thought through, because the pilots selected were highly skilled and brave, and because the tactical conditions, the specific threat of long-range German bombers over the Atlantic, had created a genuine niche where this innovation made sense. But there was another conclusion that was less discussed but no less important. The program had worked because it had been implemented by men who understood that sometimes the rules had to be broken in order to save lives. Captain Eccles of the Empire Spray, who had authorized the first camship launch, had done something that was technically within his authority, but strategically audacious. He had believed that Andrew Burr's 8 kills were important enough to risk, and he had been proven right. This principle that sometimes following the rules leads to greater loss of life than breaking the rules would become an important thread in post-war military doctrine. It was formalized in various ways. It appeared in discussions of rules of engagement. It shaped the development of special operations forces, which were often given greater flexibility in their operational parameters, because the nature of the missions they undertook made strict adherence to standard procedures counterproductive. The camship program was never attempted again after the war. There was no need. The technology evolved. The escort carriers proved to be a more comprehensive solution, but the principle that Andrew Burr and his fellow camship pilots had demonstrated remained: the principle that innovation requires risk, that courage sometimes means accepting a fate that cannot be altered, that a single person, placed in the right circumstances and armed with sufficient will and skill, can change the course of history. The human story of Andrew Burr is ultimately the story of a man who was asked to do something impossible, and who did it. But the real victory was not in the 8 confirmed kills. The real victory was in the fact that he survived to see his innovation validated. He survived to watch the principles he had demonstrated influence military doctrine for decades to come. He survived to live a full life after the war, to watch his children grow, to teach young people, to help shape a generation of pilots who learned from his example. When Andrew Burr looked back on his life from the vantage point of old age, what did he remember? The terror of the catapult launch, certainly. the clarity of combat, the cold of the Atlantic, the weight of the 8 men he had killed. But also, and perhaps more importantly, he remembered the fact that what he had done had mattered. The convoy had been protected. The principles of innovation and individual initiative had been validated. The world had moved forward because of his sacrifice and courage. That is perhaps the most fundamentally human aspect of the entire story. It is not the technology, or the tactics, or the doctrine that matters most. It is the fact that a man, an ordinary man from Surrey, who had lost his mother to influenza, who had chosen to become a pilot because he wanted to help people, who had spent years watching his friends die, that this man was able to find meaning in his sacrifice. That meaning was not compensation for the loss, but it was something. It was enough to carry him through the rest of his life with a sense of purpose. In the end, the story of Andrew Burr and the Camship program is a story about what happens when necessity meets ingenuity. It is a story about the fine line between recklessness and calculated risk. It is a story about a system, the British military in 1941, that was desperate enough to try something that had never been attempted before. And it is a story about one pilot who had the courage to step into that void. The war has been over for 80 years now. The Focke-Wulf Condors have been rust for decades. The Empire Spray was scrapped in 1952. The catapult systems are in museums, but Andrew Burr's 8 confirmed kills remain a part of the historical record. His story is studied in military academies and flying schools around the world, and his life stands as a testament to the idea that ordinary people, when placed in extraordinary circumstances, are capable of extraordinary things. On May 3, 1941, above the grey Atlantic, with a fuel tank running dry and no runway to return to, Andrew Burr proved that the unthinkable could become real, that a man could do what seemed impossible, that courage and innovation could triumph over institutional inertia, and that sometimes the greatest victories are not measured in territory gained or enemies destroyed, but in lives saved and the principles validated for future generations. This is his story, and it remains, 80 years later, a powerful reminder of what human beings are capable of when they are willing to sacrifice everything for something larger than themselves. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to WW2 Unthinkable for more remarkable tales of innovation, courage, and the extraordinary moments that shaped the Second World War. Next week, we'll be exploring another impossible mission, a story that challenges everything you thought you knew about what was actually possible during the war. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss it. And if this video resonated with you, please share it with others who love history, because history reminds us who we are and what we're capable of becoming.